The gate clicked shut behind her, but the air remained perfectly still. The farmer held out the woven basket, his fingers calloused and steady. Inside, 6 speckled eggs sat nestled against one another, their shells thin and pale. "Keep them warm and safe," he said. His voice was low, leaving no room for error. Lila reached out, her hands trembling slightly as she took the basket, feeling the cold weight of the contents shift against the wicker. A few feet away, her grandmother sat on the porch, her gaze fixed on the basket rather than the girl. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the task. Grandmother leaned forward, her voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Walk slowly," she warned. Lila nodded, her jaw set, her focus narrowing until nothing existed but the basket in her palms. She took a breath, adjusted her grip to steady the cargo, and placed her first foot onto the gravel path. Every movement was deliberate, every muscle in her arms locked to keep the basket level. The path stretched out before her, long and uneven, leading away from the safety of the port. Lila took 10 paces, then 20, keeping her eyes fixed on the gravel. But the mind is a restless thing. She imagined the eggs not as fragile shells, but as the beginning of a vast fortune. 6 chicks meant a dozen hens. A dozen hens meant 100 eggs. She calculated the profit in her head, the numbers climbing with every step she took. The weight of the basket seemed to lighten as she replaced the burden of care with the weight of gold. She thought of a blue dress with silk ribbons that caught the light, a dress fit for the wealthiest girl in the village. Her pace quickened. The steady, careful rhythm of her gait broke. She began to skip, the heels of her shoes striking the ground with a rhythmic snap. The basket swung in wide, dangerous arcs at her side. Each time it rose, the eggs shifted, knocking against the wicker sides with a soft, rhythmic tap. She tilted her head back, looking toward the horizon as if she were already riding a horse through the town square. She did not look at the ground. She did not look at the path. She was already somewhere else, and the basket danced to the beat of her unchecked imagination. The path was uneven, but Lila was miles away, her eyes tracing invisible patterns in the air. Her toe hit a protruding stone, a jagged piece of granite she had never even seen. The impact was absolute. Her forward momentum vanished instantly, replaced by a violent, uncontrolled lurch. She threw her arms out to catch her balance, but the basket was already airborne. It tipped, turning over in midair. The 6 eggs tumbled out, following the arc of her fall, the force slamming into the hard, unforgiving gravel. The sound was sharp, a series of wet cracks that echoed in the sudden silence of the garden. Yellow yolks and translucent whites pooled between of the path, seeping into the dirt. Lila landed on her knees, the pain of the impact barely registering against the shock of what she had done. She stayed there, frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The vision of the blue dress, the ribbons, and the horses dissolved like smoke in the wind. She looked down, her hands still curled in the shape of the handle she no longer held. The sticky mess on the ground was all that remained of her future. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant mocking sound of a bird from the trees. Days later, the farmer returned to the gate. He held out a new basket, the wicker clean and firm. Lila reached out, her fingers closing around the handle with such intensity that her knuckles drained of color. She did not look at the farmer. She did not look at the horizon. She looked only at her feet. Every movement was slow, calculated, and heavy. She approached the gravel path, but this time the ground was an enemy to be navigated, not a surface to be ignored. She lifted her right foot, hovered it over a loose stone, and placed it precisely on the flat earth beyond. She repeated the motion, left then right, her breath shallow and rhythmic. There were no songs in her head, no visions of silk ribbons or galloping horses. She forced her mind to remain in the present, tethered to the weight of the basket and the friction of her soles against the path. Each step was a battle against her own tendency to wander. She reached the kitchen door, paused to clear the threshold, and set the basket down on the wooden counter. The eggs were intact. She did not smile. She did not sigh. She simply stood, hands resting at her sides, waiting for the next instruction. Weeks passed in the quiet of the kitchen. Then the silence broke. A faint, rhythmic tapping came from inside the shelves. Lila sat on the floor, her back against the wooden cabinets, and held her breath. She watched as a jagged line appeared on the surface of the first egg. A tiny wet beak poked through, struggling against the resistance of the shell. It pushed, paused, and pushed again. A second egg shifted, then a third. One by one, the shells gave way. Fluffy, damp heads emerged, shaking themselves free from the remnants of their confinement. They blinked at the light, clumsy and small. Lila leaned forward, her hands pressed flat against her knees to keep from reaching out too soon. The room felt different now. The tension of the past weeks dissolved into the soft, rhythmic chirping of the new life. She looked up and found her grandmother watching from the doorway. There was no need for words. The sight of the moving, breathing creatures was the harvest of her restraint. Lila looked back at the chicks and whispered, "One step at a time." She felt the weight of her lesson settle in. The dream was no longer a distant vision, but a living, breathing reality resting in her hands.